Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Niko Skievaski, co-founder and president of Redox. Redox is a digital platform that integrates and exchanges data, allowing healthcare organizations to connect once to the platform and become able to interchange data across a broad ecosystem of users. Welcome, Niko, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, David.
I hope I did it justice, but I'd appreciate it if you could give us a deeper intro to Redox, to the problems that you're solving.
Yeah, for sure. So we saw this problem started to arise back in my days when I worked at Epic. One of the things that we noticed was every time we implemented the EHR, that came with 200, 400 different interfaces out to other systems that were used within the healthcare setting. So these are, ancillary type software applications, like your lab system and your check-in systems and all sorts of other software systems. And one of the things that we saw happening in the market was that these other software applications were all moving to the cloud and, kind of going the way of the rest of software, using a SaaS model and all of that, moving to the cloud. And that really, electronic health records were never equipped to talk to or share data outside of their data center. So communicating with the cloud was kind of this void that we saw. So that was a lot of the inspiration behind Redox. And as we started talking with more and more, especially startups, it became very clear that they're experts in their product and listening to customers and trying to figure out how to build something to add value in the healthcare space. But when it comes to actually getting down to the kind of legacy IT systems used within healthcare, their knowledge fell really short. And so Redox is really a service that allows these software developers who are making apps to easily share data with the health systems that are their customers. So we think of Redox as a two-sided network with developers on one side and health systems on the other. We're simply sucking up data from health systems, standardizing it, and then making it available to these developers over an API. So it's a very much a networked approach to interoperability, and specifically for kind of these applications building various digital health solutions within space.
Well, you make it sound simple, Niko. But we've been talking about interoperability in this world of ours for quite some time. So I wonder if we could step back a little bit and talk about interoperability in general, and sort of the regulatory structures and what I'll call the real world seem to be working on different timelines.
Yeah.
So where do you think we are really in the real world today? And does this discontinuity, sort of getting ahead of the regulators, concern you at all?
That's a really good question. Interoperability in general, I see it as kind of this fundamental market failure. I have a background in economics, so I can't help but think of it in those terms. Interoperability is something that intuitively, anyone can agree. Yeah, the data should follow the patient. The patient should be able to go to a different provider and bring really the golden record, as we call it in the interoperability world, the full longitudinal record of every encounter and every medication and procedure and all of that the patient has ever engaged with to whatever provider that they're working with, to really make sure that the continuity of care is ideal and there's not duplicative efforts and stuff like that. And so that's a very kind of easy thing to agree with and be on board with. But the incentives of the market are such that making that possible is very difficult. So it's not necessarily that it's technically difficult to do. It is just economically difficult to do because many health systems see their patient data that they're sitting on top of as an asset to the organization. So to pull it out to very simple terms, it's like asking Walmart and Target to share their customer data. They have a bunch of data about buying behaviors and, addresses of where their customers live, and, they send them marketing communication and all of that. And so their customer information is a huge asset that they utilize to better maximize profits as a business. In the healthcare setting, it's kind of taboo to talk about profit maximization, but these are businesses, right? And they do look at their margins, their notoriously shrinking margins, and they have to figure out ways to survive and generate revenue. And sharing data openly will mean that patients can more easily leave their ecosystem. So if a large health system that has all of the services from primary care through the acute setting wants to keep that patient within their ecosystem, holding onto their data is one way that it introduces a barrier, it introduces some friction to patients leaving a health system to patient shopping. That's kind of at this very black and white sort of economics level why there's essentially this market failure around the market providing interoperability on its own. And this is the flavor of interoperability that is very much the sort of standard definition of it, that data should follow a patient. What Redox really looks at is, well, what are use cases where making the data more liquid, more easily available actually fits an economic model that aligns incentives around payers and providers and patients. And that's when health systems are wanting to use new digital tools to enable their services to work out more effectively. So, things like telehealth or remote patient monitoring or social determinants of health sort of solutions. There's kind of this whole different categories of digital health that health systems are trying to purchase to increase efficiencies and increase quality of care and things like that. And that's really where we play, is fitting in that mold where health systems are happy to do it. It fits within their economic models, and the problem still exists. Our long-term goal is to create this network such that it can be used for multiple different use cases. But it's really this kind of B2B software use case that we're building the network upon. So contrasting that with a lot of the efforts in the industry, so both the regulatory environments as well as consortiums and things like that, a lot of those efforts are focused on how do we enable the continuity of care interoperability use case, and that's much more aligned with kind of using policy to combat the market forces that are really preventing interoperability from happening today. So this includes forcing healthcare organizations to share data in certain ways, forcing them to use things like HIEs or other similar sort of mechanisms to share data, forcing the adoption of certain standards so that this becomes easier. So if we look at policy over the years, and starting back with we can almost tie it all the way back to meaningful use, or even HIPAA before that. It's really looking at how do we release data in a more consistent way, either provider to provider or provider to patient. So meaningful use stage 2, they talk about how a patient has the right to pull down their medical record in a digital format. And so that was kind of the regulation. In practice, what happened was, and this is you could go and look at your privacy policy at your doctor's office today, and they'll talk about how you can get your data in a digital form. But that digital form, at least in all the ones that I've read, is typically a PDF burned onto a DVD that they'll mail to you. So it's digital, but
right,
it's
very digital. Yes.
Yeah, I don't even have a mechanism to look at a DVD anymore, because computers don't even have drives, and it's a PDF, so it's not very shareable either. I guess you could email that thing around, but now you're emailing PHI. But if it's your PHI, I guess that's fine. So there's that was meaningful use stage 2. More recently, with 21st Century Cures, we have new proposals out there, and I should say much more heavy-handed proposals around a new regulatory scheme that will bring more. It's really sticks. It's not carrots this time. It's they're bringing out different various penalties for not sharing data in certain ways, and starting to target EHR vendors as data blockers, and defining what that means, and bringing penalties to those who do data block. So yeah, it's an interesting world. I think as far as being ahead of it, I think it's a great place to be, because Redox has been operating within the spirit of these regulations since we started the company about 5 years ago. So when we see the regulatory environment start pushing people towards the type of behavior, that's really tailwinds for us. We're installed at 600 plus health systems across the country. And if it will now be regulated that people have to share data with the mechanisms that we've already implemented, that's phenomenal, because now it kind of gives a regulatory value proposition to what we've already been providing, and enables us to realize the vision of Redox, which is to enable the free and kind of open access of data in a faster way, because we don't have to battle against some of the market failures that I discussed earlier.
Do you see the sort of ideal future state maybe that we're heading towards as involving tools and rules that might be inconsistent with the tools that you've already put in place? I mean, is there a drawback in that sense to being an early actor?
No, I wouldn't say so. The spirit of the law is spot on. They're talking about in a business to business setting, we should have APIs that are available, and the API should work as such. And so in the details of how it's going to be implemented, sure, Redox will need to make some updates and all of that, but we have been doing it essentially in this manner since we started and have built our engine to do that from the beginning. And so rather than having to re-architect a system from the ground up, it's kind of just, making sure that we can check the boxes around certain specified technical requirements that, will be released when the final rules come out. So I think being an early player in the space will give us a huge advantage to help people meet those regulatory requirements, but more importantly, derive the value that the market should be able to get out of being interoperable. So that's something that, has always been kind of at the core of what we're trying to do here. And I think the regulations just kind of shine a light on that and will increase demand for the products that we have out there.
When you talk about value, are you looking at this in terms of just sort of reduced transaction costs, improved healthcare experience for an individual patient, just because organization A can get the information they need about a patient from organization B? Or are you looking at something broader than that? Is there a systems level benefit to all of this?
Yeah, for sure. And, as a millennial entrepreneur, it's always about the greater good, right? So it's not coming down to the cold hard dollars here, but like the world that could be enabled if data was really liquid and standardized in the space is drastically different than the world that we have today in healthcare. It's been commonly cited that healthcare spending is about a third of what we spend is waste, which is literally hundreds of trillions of dollars. That's just waste every single year being spent in healthcare. And good portions of that is excessive administrative costs. So moving paper around. It is inefficiently delivered care or redundant care. So there's all these different areas that we know technology should be able to make an impact in. The accessibility of care is another big area where, it's a huge cost drivers. If we look at where these additional costs lie, you can kind of take each slice of that pie of inefficiency and identify 100 different startups trying to tackle that problem and drive efficiency into the market through their solutions. And if those solutions can get to market and start using their data without the barriers that exist today, then we should be able to realize some of those efficiency gains. And when we look at healthcare expenses in the country reaching, approaching 20% of GDP, like that's what needs to happen to fundamentally change our healthcare delivery model is efficiency gains being driven into the system. And those efficiency gains will come from incumbent healthcare players adopting new technologies and changing the way that they deliver care. It will also come from new entrant healthcare providers. And we're starting to see this, especially on the fringes of primary care right now, like new different ways and different business models of delivering care to certain types of patients.
Right. Yeah.
As those things start to emerge, that's where we're going to start to see taking a bite out of that expenditure. Because at what point does this all break down? Is it at 25%, 30% of GDP? Like what? No one's ever gone that high. So at what point does the economy fail because of it? And something's got to give before then, and we'll start to see that through the evolution of the market.
Yes. If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Niko Skievaski, co-founder and president of Redox. So if we get to this future state that we're working towards, Niko, what does that do for us? I mean, there's great interchange of data, there's availability of information, but do we collectively have the analytical tools that can make use of more data? Or how are we doing with the data that we have today in the healthcare system?
Yeah, so there's a tremendous amount of data being produced every day at healthcare systems. Redox alone sees 8 million patient records flow through our system every single day. Tons of data, right? The challenge in using it comes down to a few things. First and foremost, kind of on the theme of what I've been talking about earlier, is does the economics make sense such that we want to crunch that data? Currently, and this there's kind of two different trains of thoughts here around how to make that possible. One approach is give the data to the patient, because the patient is really at the center of all of this, right? The patient, and that includes every one of us. We all have an incentive to be healthy. It's literally life or death, right? So if there are certain applications or programs that we could be a part of where we could essentially be the brokers of our own data to receive some benefit from it, then that should be the choice of the sovereign consumer or the patient in this example. So there's this trend of consumerism kind of going on in healthcare, which is trying to fix a lot of the problems in the market around consumer choice. If we can reduce information asymmetry and make sure patients understand their options, make sure they understand the cost of each of these options, the likelihood of success, then the sovereign patient can make that decision more in a more informed way and act more like a market, and all of the efficiency gains that come with a market. So that's kind of on one hand a way to align incentives around utilizing that data. On the other hand, we're also seeing almost the opposite, where we have this movement towards value-based care. And in a value-based care paradigm, it's not necessarily putting the patient at the center of it. Well, I shouldn't be that harsh. It's more so focused on the organizations that work with the patient and saying, if we can align the doctor, the hospital, and the payer around a patient's care. And when I say doctor, I mean, the entire care team and, any specialists and all of that. So align all of those three around the patient care and come up with incentive schemes and reimbursement mechanisms to make sure that those three parties are working together for the common good, or the bottom line, the same bottom line. Then we can align incentives such that there won't be redundancies in care, that we want to keep patients out of hospitals because that's a very high costly care setting. We don't want complications or readmissions because those are highly costly, right? And so that's the sort of other paradigm that we can see looking into the future that will force us to use the data more appropriately and figure out, how do we better segment our population of patients? How do we focus on the patients that are higher risk? This is where like population health comes into play, and remote patient monitoring, and all of these sort of newer tools that will be so much more important. Social determinants of health will be so much more important in a value-based care paradigm. So that's the other kind of economic scheme that we can see driving demand for better use of these data. One of the things that I've been grappling with in my mind is like, are these two at odds? Because consumerism is, empowering the patient to make choices on their own, whereas a value-based care paradigm is empowering the IDN or the ACO or whatever the acronym is to describe the conglomerate of those three parties to better make decisions on behalf of patients. So it's almost like this very individualism focused world, or a more kind of centrally managed control kind of situation from an ACO. And I'm not sure if they're at odds or if they're complementary, but
right. I mean, we hope that the medical industrial complex is working to benefit the patient, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully we're all pulling in the same direction. Though, as you observe, as we creep towards that 20% of GDP mark, we start to wonder if we are indeed all pulling in the same direction, and what tools we might have at our disposal to try to get things back on track to a more rational approach. And sort of the value-based care idea is sort of the latest in a long list of experiments that we've inflicted upon ourselves. And perhaps this is the one that takes.
The thing that really worries me about, these experiments, as you called them, that we've taken upon ourselves as an industry, is that at the end of the day, no matter what, we need to shrink as an industry. Because if we're at 20% GDP and based on, our economy and the our income as an economy, we should be at about 12%. GDP is kind of like what the health economists are saying is kind of ideal. That means that we have to lose 8% of spending, which means that jobs will be driven out. Companies will have to shrink. It is unheard of as a company, as someone running a company, to want to shrink your organization.
Do you want to tell them? I don't want to tell them.
Exactly. So that's why I'm a little skeptical of the incumbents in the industry actually solving it on our own. I think there's going to have to be disruption that will cause tremendous pressure from the outside. And this is where I get excited by, some of our tech giants starting to move into healthcare and, threaten to go outside of the traditional models and start up their own clinics and start up their own hospitals and start up their own ways to pay for care. Because that's what's going to put pressure on the market is fundamentally different ways of doing it. And, we could also look at the political landscape and see, is there going to be sweeping regulatory change beyond just payment reform? And I'm also pretty skeptical of anything making drastic change there, just because of how entrenched the healthcare industry, being so huge in our country, is very powerful in their abilities to influence legislation and all of that. And so it's an uphill battle to actually try to change things. And so change might have to happen from the outside.
I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric flying around, obviously. I'll go out on a limb here and say that I don't expect Medicare for all next year, but I would expect there to be some change, if there's no matter who's elected into office in the next round, there's likely to be further change in the industry. But going back to what you said a moment ago, it's sort of interesting to think about, as you said, folks from outside the healthcare sphere coming in and saying, well, this is an opportunity or something we should be working on fixing, and coming at it from the outside without healthcare experience, without the baggage perhaps of years and decades of dealing with the system as it is. Do you see that as a necessary piece of this, as sort of the innovations coming from beyond the four walls, or do you think it can come from within?
Yeah, I absolutely think that external innovation or disruption, as the buzzword is, I absolutely think that's necessary to change our industry today. We are all patients, and every time we are a patient, when we go into the healthcare setting, we are confronted with poor customer service experiences, archaic technology. We're confronted with clipboards, which is like the only time I've used a clipboard in the past decade was at in the healthcare setting. It's like stepping back in time. And what that means is that it won't stay within the industry, because there's large companies out there that have huge interest in both keeping their employees healthy and making sure that they can do that at a reasonable cost, as well as from an entirely opportunistic standpoint. It's an industry that is obviously worth disrupting, because it's so important. There's so much money being spent on it. And if you can deliver a 10x improvement in care, then you can definitely capture a market. Additionally, in the employer setting, because we have kind of captive customers there, employers can drastically experiment with their own employees. So there's a little more leeway to do experimentation there, and there's a ton of incentive as an employer to do that. It is just
right. I think that sort of that's where a lot of the action is, or should be, or could be, really in the next generation, is sort of seeing plan design evolve at the employer level, because it's not necessarily happening at the plan level.
Employers managing your healthcare is kind of this relic of the Great World War, right? And so we've kind of, like, based on happenstance, ended up in the situation where employers have tremendous power here. But I hope there's also an influx of like direct to consumer models as well, where you don't have to have an employer tied to your healthcare, because there's all sorts of inefficiencies that come with that, and job mobility and things of that nature.
Right, sure.
But if we can figure out how to directly engage consumers in the healthcare market in such a way where an efficient insurance market emerges, or an efficient, even kind of like direct primary care, I think was a great example before that kind of went by the wayside. But what are different models where consumers are actually willing to pay something and find it that much better than the traditional healthcare delivery models, which is paying for insurance in a traditional sense.
Right. So you talk about what are patients willing to pay for. The flip side of that, something that occurs to me as we're talking, is the question of, should patients be compensated for the use of their data? It's an issue that comes up again and again when we talk about the value of data in healthcare and the value of data in developing algorithms and tools for managing population health or dealing with individual diseases or conditions. Have you thought about this? Does your technology move in the direction of being able to track sharing of data at a granular level? Is that something that could be used to systematize compensation for patients for use of their data, or is that a rabbit hole not worth going down in your view?
No, I think it's a very relevant conversation of the times, and even outside of health data, this is a hot topic, right, for companies like Google and Facebook and others who are basically data businesses and acquire lots of data about consumers. And I don't think anyone wants healthcare to go in that world where there's a company in the middle that's just making wild profits off of using people's healthcare data. That being said, I think that the only way to solve this problem is to make the patient the broker of her own data, meaning that they control where it goes, they control who sees it, and how it's shared. And if someone wants to use it for a profitable purpose, then the patient opts into that. And so it's not an opt-out model. It should be very much an opt-in, where the patient says, yeah, I care about, that disease that pharmaceutical company is researching. So I'll let them use my data, and then maybe they'll develop a drug and make billions on it, but like, that's fine. I'm cool with it. Or or open up these data brokerage models where companies can actually pay for the use of the data. So, if I want to use your medical record as a control in my study, then, maybe you're compensated a couple cents every time it's used or something like that. I think from a theoretical sense, that's how it should work. Making that happen in reality is going to take some time. The systems in healthcare right now that share data are not designed in that way. If we think of just HL7 in general, it's a fire hose of data that they can point in any direction and shoot at any vendor that a health system might be working with. Sure, the vendor needs to log where all the data is being stored and who accesses and all of that, but health systems can for sure just kind of share data very widely, and it could be very easy to lose track of where all of it goes. So the GDPR-like data sharing practices are definitely creeping into the healthcare space. I know Redox is looking at all of our policies and trying to make sure that we are respecting data in that way, because although it's not mandated here in the States yet, we assume that flavor of data protection and privacy will come upon us, and we want to make sure that we're ready for that and we can support that new world where data is an asset owned by the individual and should be respected as such.
Okay. So, Niko, lightning round to wrap up. We're talking about the future, and I want to ask you more broadly, if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what is one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect to find has changed dramatically?
I have two answers for this. My first one is, as a patient, I just really hope that healthcare actually has a better customer service model. It's the sort of paternalism and lack of information that happens every time you go to the doctor, I think is unacceptable. And in a modern world, especially 5 years from now, I hope that it's very different in the sense that the patient is in control. They have a lot more information about what's going on, and they have a lot more tools to understand, to let them know what to do with that data, so they can make better decisions based on their care. So hoping for kind of a world where the best healthcare systems are delivering that experience, and the worst ones are, patients are leaving them to go towards those better ones. So kind of that market driven adoption process. From a business standpoint, like from an interoperability world, I hope that we've made tremendous progress on actually releasing the data within the next 5 years and making it more available and useful. And it comes in a couple of different flavors. First is, I hope that patients will be able to pull their data down from all of their providers and put it in one place. And, this is kind of the dream of Apple's Health Kit, but other mechanisms will start to emerge. We just saw Commonwealth announce that they'll be making this available to Android users for data that Commonwealth touches, which is, a different sort of type of, different healthcare records than a lot of what Apple's tapping into right now. But, I hope that it's available like that so actual patients can get their data and then enable applications to use it, which is a lot of at the core of what the ONC has proposed in their proposed rule. But I hope that actually comes true because, we've seen regulations in the past have really great intentions, but 10 years later, they're still, the dream of them has not been fulfilled.
That's right. Well, stay tuned, everyone, and we'll see what happens. Thank you, Niko. This has been great.
Maybe in 5 years we can do this conversation again and see what.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see
how it turned out.
We'll see how we did. Great.
Thanks a lot, David.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.